So I just want to start by asking you all to just discuss a little bit what is the state of visual literacy in your fields and what are the challenges you're facing?
I'll dive in, I guess.
Go ahead.
Go for it. This way.
Yeah.
Okay. Mainly because I'm the only person without art and design in my title. So maybe I'll have a slightly different answer. So I'm in education and information, and I have a chance to look sort of across campus also at what's going on. And I think, you know, there are certain sort of signature pedagogies in different domains that involve the use of visuals in different ways. But in teaching, sometimes sometimes we're able to embody them well, sometimes we're not. Education doesn't really have a signature pedagogy per se, especially around visual arts. We don't really teach teachers to be art teachers. Actually, that happens sometimes in the School of Art and Design. Information is a little more focused on it because, of course, we think a lot about interfaces and human-computer interaction, and so we think a lot about the affordances of things. But I'm going to make a sort of a bold statement that isn't intended to apply to all of my colleagues. But I think when we teach, we're not super good about modeling in these fields what we intend our students to be thinking about. There's an over-reliance on the PowerPoint slide. We're having a long lunchtime conversation about PowerPoint. There's an over-reliance on the lecture and written text. And when students interact with the media that we intend them to be thinking with, it tends to be the hands-on project work they do. But by and large, I would rate the state of visual literacy on campus as not great when we're not talking about schools with art or design in their names. I won't speak for those schools because we have people here who can.
Okay. Well, talking about that, I'm so surprised at how like exposed the students are, you know, like to all this visual information every day, and yet you should guide them, or that's what I'm trying to do, like, you know, in this process to understand what it means to create visual information. That it's not just a matter of adding some like visual effects or like just like making a 3-click procedure. So what I'm trying to say is that I have also that challenge, but it's interesting to see how the old school, the principles that you mentioned yesterday, for example, they need to be part of the things that you bring into the classroom, because through them and by having conversations around them when you do some critique on their work, I think that's the way to start instilling this idea that, oh, this is how I see. This is how I can see. How can I take a phenomenon, deconstruct it, understand it, and then think how it can be transformed visually. So from my perspective is that I think that there's a lot of visual information out there, but we do need to use pedagogy as that conduit, you know, like to instill principles in our students.
We just have you guys just talk a little closer to the mic, that's all. Thanks.
Yes.
Okay. Am I close enough? Is that good? Yeah, okay. I have the feeling that I'm a little bit misplaced on this panel, because indeed, I am a cartoonist, a graphic novelist. My background, my master's degree was in biomedical communication, so I was doing medical illustration, surgical illustration, so I was using probably a lot of the tools or ideas that you guys might teach in or about. But yet, I think of myself primarily as an artist, and before you ask me what is that, I'll just say that I look at my students that way too. So sometimes I suggest, if they're doing comics, if they want to do comics, that they read things like Understanding Comics after they've created 100 pages.
Yeah.
Because I really think of comics as a relatively new medium, although we've always communicated in kind of similar ways throughout history. But I think that to look at comics or to read them and be noticing the balloons, the space between the panels, everything else, before you have a sense of it kind of intuitively, is to look at things, patterns as rules, or even potentially as rules, is paralyzing for an artist sometimes. And that's not to say all of them, but some of them. Because I think we are all visually literate. I mean, we really are. We don't always trust that, but we interpret things very quickly when we look at images. We know what looks nice, what doesn't. We know how to read comics. We know how to look at images in magazines and get something out of them, although we might not always know what it is. So, but why I say I'm in the wrong place is because I don't focus on how to communicate information or how to build interfaces in that way. I look at the student work more as literature, which is, of course, communicating a lot, but in a very different way. And it might be very subtle, and it might be, you know, the message is unwritten, really, but in the end, you get the message. So, anyway, so maybe I should leave.
Please stay.
Right.
Well, I think there's more than one way to feel like you don't belong on this panel. I was really puzzled what I could possibly say about this topic or what perspective, and then I realized, oh yes, I've been thinking about this for a long time, starting from when I made the transition from overhead transparencies to PowerPoint, and how discombobulating that was for me as a teacher, because I was moving from a dynamic medium, real time, to static, and it was a completely different thing. And then I fell into all of the mistakes that you made, that you alluded to last time. I decorated my slides, and they were so darn pretty, but I wasn't sure why the students were getting it. So then I had to think, well, how can I help what I'm showing them, help them to guide them to the information that I want? You know, and this was stumbling along, because what do we know, those of us who aren't artists in the School of Art and Design, what do we know about this? You know, so it was a little bit of a pick-up education. And then on top of that was annoyance, which I think drives a lot of our work. You know, like, how many bad PowerPoints can I look at in my life until I decide I'm not going to look at any of them ever again. I'm not going to let my students make them as their final report. You know, I've got the image of is it vaudeville, when the hook would come out from behind the curtain and drag people off stage? Like, the next person, when I'm on a conference that says, oh, I know you can't see what I put on this slide because the font is too small. You know, I just want to hook them off the stage at that point. I realized I had to learn something about how to communicate effectively visually before I could teach students how to do that, and I'm still deeply involved in that task. But the other thing about visualizing information that I'm concerned about is not just external visualization, but internal visualization. Because since I teach anatomy, and I want students to make sense of what they're seeing, to learn how to see when they're looking at something, how to guide that process, and how to construct a schematic, a meaningful schematic of that dense real-world information. So then I had to think, well, do I do that by telling them the words that they will transform into a mental image of anatomy in their heads, or do I show them pictures of the anatomy and try teaching them the salient features in what they're looking at? And maybe it's a combination between the two, which is a whole nother ball of wax, putting words and images together. But I actually did a study about that, because it turns out in the literature in anatomy, you know, everyone thinks, oh, anatomy is so visual. But actually, in terms of teaching anatomy, it wasn't so clear. There was actually conflicting literature the hook might come out because of the time I'm spending on this, so let me know, Linda. But the evidence wasn't there if words or pictures were better for teaching anatomy, and I thought, isn't that interesting? So I actually taught some concepts just using images and taught some concepts just using text and did the study. And it turns out that images were much more powerful even when the assessment was word-based. You know, so, whoa, I use pictures now. I mean, images. So that really convinced me of, whoa, there's something going on here with visual information.
And also, just a question on that. I mean, there's a third possibility, which is just take a cadaver and get in there. And so that's very visual, and you're probably explaining things. So what is that?
Well, that is something that is an ever-elusive activity. In medical schools, not all medical schools, do the students even dissect anymore.
Really?
Oh yeah, because it's expensive, and guess what? We have 3D imaging now, so why go to the trouble of it's mostly the time. Medical students, there's so much of an information load, they can't devote 4 hours a day, 5 days a week for 2 semesters to do that process, which is how I learned it.
Yeah, because I also think it's an emotional lesson.
Oh, yes.
And so we had to look at cadavers, and
Right.
it was a very powerful
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah.
Literally visceral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
So
important.
that part,
Yeah.
yes, it's,
Yeah.
yeah.
But Melissa, didn't you lead, I have a little insider information here, didn't you lead a bunch of students last summer to look at art in order to learn about anatomy?
I did.
I mean, did they even know how to look?
No, they did not. So I teach students, let me soften that a little bit. I teach students who want to go on and become physical therapists or MDs or PTs, physical therapists. And so they are your STEM student, allow me to stereotype for a moment, really good test takers. It's all about the GPA. So here we are looking at Bernini sculptures in Rome and asking, or what, you know, all of the wonderful things one can look at in terms of Italian Renaissance art, and asking what did they see, and they struggled to even be able to describe what they were looking at. They didn't have the vocabulary, they didn't know foreground, background, light, dark, texture, material, let alone what all those things might be connoting. They couldn't make sense of it if it wasn't already transcribed for them into something that looked medical on the page. That really opened my eyes in terms of maybe getting back to the question to the panel, which was, what is the state of visual literacy? I echo Barry's comment. It's not so good for many of the students on campus. They don't have the skills to effectively describe what they know to others, to communicate with others, and also the flip side of that, seeing, I think is a challenge. Knowing how to talk about visual information without some training.
And to maybe to make you feel better about your stance as versus being sort of teacher versus artist, none of us are actually taught how to teach.
Yeah.
That's sort of a classic of higher education.
Yeah.
Right?
But
So we're not necessarily great at helping people. You may be better at it.
No, but the difference in what you're trying to express, I guess, to the students, I guess. Yeah.
Sure, yeah. No, by all means. Oh, also, you might want to get a few pieces of paper because I had 10 thoughts and most of them are long gone. Because I forgot, because you guys were saying some fantastic things. I have to say, Phoebe, I think it was you who had mentioned irritation. I just realized just in the moment, like, what a gift irritation is. The key is to interrogate your irritation. What about it is bothering you? Because like nearly all progress starts with something that just bugs the hell out of you. But you have to pull that string. You have to figure it out.
She said it.
What's it, Melissa? Yeah. You said the thing about your. Sorry. Seeing. We just at the very end there. I was reminded. There's talking about what you see is important, but also learning to see is sometimes learning to transcend the words that we use to describe seeing. Edward Tufte sometimes quotes Paul Valéry? I'm not sure how his name is pronounced, Frenchman, I assume, who says that to see is to forget the name of the thing seen. And I think that's very true. I think that often by describing what we see, we're in some ways bottling it up a little and sometimes losing the experience of seeing. You should be very cognizant of the experience of seeing in and of itself in the absence of any kind of name. There's a moment in the classroom where you begin to genuinely learn. We've all experienced it when we begin to have that sensation of learning, when we really want to move. We've just figured something out. The teacher has successfully penetrated our consciousness, and we now understand what they're saying, and we understand what comes next, and we learn, and then there's a moment which ostensibly is a moment of great victory, a kind of victory lap, where having taught us that, out comes the chalk. And the teacher says, we call this, and then the chalk hits the blackboard, and they begin to write the word that describes whatever it is that you've just learned. And it's presented as a moment of victory and accomplishment. Now it has a name. But I don't know about you, but my heart sinks a little. It dies a little once you give it a name. I don't perceive that to be a moment of accomplishment. It's a moment where the learning stops. And though we have to give things names, it's like a cutscene in a game that you're really enjoying, you know, where now you have to stop and be told a little story by a couple of talking heads or something. It's when learning stops. It's the moment where learning goes from this living thing into its museum state. I find that when showing things, I came up with a lot of terminology in my notes. I'm taking notes for this book I'm working on about visual communication, and I keep coming up with terms. They're very impressive sounding. They'd be great at a cocktail party. But, and I have to use them in my notes because my notes are just writing mostly. They're just words. But then it comes time to actually do the comic and show it. And I find that just showing it and describing it at the end of that sequence, there's no need to give it a name. I've just shown it. It doesn't need a name half the time. There were a bunch of other things, but I forgot what they all were. But now we can write things down, so it's okay. But yeah, you guys said some really fantastic stuff, and now I forgot what I was going to say about it.
I'll ask you a question back about the naming
Yeah.
of things, because I think a lot of teaching is about trying to communicate the systems we use to name things.
Yeah.
We're trying to teach our students the actual sort of ontology of things. But my advisor used to say to me all the time, the better any community gets at talking to each other, the harder it is for anyone else to understand what they mean.
Yeah.
In comics, so it's interesting, there were many times you explain a thing that is going on in a comic, and I say to myself, oh, I hadn't even realized that. And sometimes I think, did I experience it? And I wonder if you feel something similar going on, right? That what an artist means, and maybe others have these thoughts, you know, that your intent doesn't always get communicated. Readers are experiencing it in very different ways, and how you think about that. Because as a teacher, I expect my students to be experiencing these ideas in different ways, but I'm trying to kind of tamp them down, right? To try to control and understand what the different ways are, so I know when somebody's too far astray from what I was hoping they would take away from the message.
Right.
Well, just to clarify, are you referring to like a panel from one of Scott's books where he's showing something and then explaining something and you didn't get it initially? Is that what you're referring
that's
to?
Exactly what I'm saying, right? I didn't perceive it that way.
Right.
I find it interesting nonetheless.
But generally, for pedagogical purposes, you're taking things out of context, out of their original context, and then talking about them, right? So it's not surprising that you might not get it, but if it were in context, you may very well have understood it.
Well, but also by reading the books, I'm becoming more literate, right, in comics. So
Right.
maybe I'll see it the next time I encounter it.
Right, but
yeah.
you-
Oh, that was one of
yeah,
the things.
yeah.
That's right, Phoebe. And this time it was definitely you. You said that you thought it was important to experience for newcomers to experience reading before they read anything like my book.
Experience writing.
Yeah, or
And
creating
reading,
it. Yeah.
yeah,
That
yeah.
To have a profound engagement
Yeah.
with the medium before you had the guy in the check shirt and glasses
Yeah.
giving things terminology and showing the demonstrate. And I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Because and again that goes back to that idea of seeing without naming, experiencing something and not feeling the need to put it in a bottle. That's really important. And what you had said, Barry, is that idea of like the students maybe interpreting things differently. And of course you have to prune that tree because there's only a next step if they're still on the main road. So that's why that the variety of interpretation gets forever pruned back so that they're still with you when the next sequential step comes. It's not as if you can have that combinatorial explosion of branching interpretations. That has to happen. Because that was one of them anyway. That was one of the things. Oh, and I remember the one other thing. Okay, I'll be quick. I'm sorry. The other thing about visual literacy now is we are at least taking step one, which is recognizing the value of pictures as text because we are, with each subsequent generation, we're feeling increasingly confident in using images as part of our language, not as illustration, but as words, as thoughts, as emotions in our communication, because what's going upstream includes a lot more pictures. We're using more pictures in our communication.
And it probably all comes down to the fact that it's really cheap to use them.
Yeah.
Now that we have the internet. So we use them, yeah.